Are we talking about just things like anxiety and depression? Are we talking about brain fog? Are we talking about energy? Can you define the areas that our gut is impacting in our brain?
The neurodegenerative diseases, Parkinson's and cognitive decline, Alzheimer's. By midlife, this imbalance between the brain and the gut will manifest in degenerative changes within the brain.
For people who don't have access to the ideal diet, what are some things that most people would have access to that would actually move the needle?
There's some really exciting developments that are also good for gut health. So one is...
There's a lot of conversation about autism right now. Do you think there's a vaccine connection to autism? What do you think about dairy?
It's another controversial topic. If that can be confirmed and what tests you need for that, that would have huge implications. And I think this could become a standard.
How do GLP-1s impact our gut microbiome? Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Liz Moody Podcast. Today, we're diving into one of my absolute favorite topics, gut health, and we are exploring how it impacts conditions like IBS, brain fog, anxiety, depression, autism, Parkinson's, dementia, and more. We're going to talk about exactly what impacts our gut and thus our brain health during our childhood, our adult life, and even in utero. And because this is the Liz Moody Podcast, we're going to share exact tips and techniques that you can use to help your brain via your gut. Our guest today is Dr. Emeran Mayer. He is a gastroenterologist, he is a neuroscientist, and a distinguished research professor at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. He is the executive director of the G. Oppenheimer Center for Neurobiology of Stress and Resilience and the founding director of the Goodman-Luskin Microbiome Center at UCLA. Dr. Mayer has published over 430 scientific papers. He has co-edited 3 books, and he is the author of the bestsellers The Mind-Gut Connection, The Gut-Immune Connection, and Interconnected Plates. Basically, he's one of the world's leading experts on how our gut and our brain are intricately connected. If you have any of the conditions that I listed earlier, or you want to do your best to help prevent those conditions, or you're just curious about how you can optimize your gut better for better overall well-being, this episode is going to give you so much food for thought, and it's going to really help you approach these things in a way that you probably have not heard elsewhere. And if you know anybody who's dealing with anxiety, hello, I'm raising my hand, or gut issues, send them this episode. There's so much stuff in here that even I had never heard before, so I really hope that it changes all of your lives. Emeran, welcome to the podcast.
Nice to be here, Liz.
I'm such a fan of your work, and I'm just such a fan. So I personally, backstory for you, I've dealt with anxiety for years and years and years. And so for me, unlocking these pieces of these things that can be contributing to my mental health and to my brain health has been really, really profound. So when we talk about how our gut impacts our brain health, our mental health, are we talking about just things like anxiety and depression? Are we talking about brain fog? Are we talking about energy? Are we talking about dementia? Are we talking about Parkinson's? Can you define the areas that our gut is impacting in our brain?
You may feel the butterflies for both positive and negative things. So when somebody falls in love, they might feel the butterflies. You know, it's just the emotional arousal that is reflected in the gut. So these are these ultra short-term connections. Then with anxiety and depression, that's usually a persistent relationship that starts very early in life. These issues like brain fog, there's mechanisms that we know, like inflammatory molecules that are generated in the gut that reach the brain and that create this, this brain fog phenomenon. So I think that's fairly well established. And then there's these more long-term things. There's the neurodegenerative diseases, Parkinson's and cognitive decline, Alzheimer's. So by midlife, this imbalance between the brain and the gut will manifest in degenerative changes within the brain. So we also know inflammatory conditions of the gut, like ulcerative colitis, or they also are associated with a greater prevalence of Alzheimer's disease later in life. So any inflammatory or immune activation process going on in your gut, either from your diet, lifelong chronic inflammatory diet, there's many conditions nowadays that we say where microbes play a role in generating immune activation in the gut. So it's not full-blown inflammation, but immune cells are activated and then they can get to the brain and you won't even know it. So it's like high blood pressure, and heart attacks. So if somebody doesn't measure your blood pressure, you won't know until you have the heart attack. And it's kind of similar with this low-grade inflammation, that you don't have a fever, you don't have pain. So this is why there's very serious. And one thing I forgot, so neurodevelopmental anxiety is one. And the other one is autism spectrum disorders, which start very early in life. I actually believe they start in utero. And it's the microbiome of the mother and the inflammatory situation in the mother that reaches the developing fetus in the placenta. And then when the child is born, it has already an altered brain. And then the exposure to an environment will then bring out the full-blown, autism spectrum picture.
Is there a reason that some gut inflammation would manifest as anxiety and other would manifest as Parkinson's? How come different guts that are experiencing trauma manifest these different conditions?
Yeah, certainly genetic factors, vulnerability genes play a big role. Any of these low-grade inflammatory changes in the gut, 40% of the population is overweight and obese. So, obesity, has the cosmetic dimension, which is not that important really, but it has the metabolic implication. And that's really the danger, there's a lot of talk about this now with this Make America Healthy Again movement, which I think that movement is actually great that this is finally happening and being talked about by a lot of people. In my opinion, unfortunately, it's in the wrong hands. It's not the people that really understand this. So this is really an epidemic, that we have this disturbance. Simply taking probiotics, for example, will not help that. It's all the metabolic changes that come along with the wrong diet and the lack of exercise. And since most of the immune cells of our body are in the gut, the gut becomes the center of this whole problem.
But like the way that these things are appearing, like me with my anxiety, my gut might have had some sort of issues, and then that would have been combined with maybe childhood trauma and a predisposition to anxiety, and that's why that manifested in that way for me.
So you mentioned the word early life adversity. That's a big factor. And there's a range of these things, like discord between the parents that ultimately results in divorce. So it's not the divorce, it's before the struggle, the unstable family environment.
Which is so interesting because so many parents are like, we want to stay together for the kids. And it's actually that discord before and
exactly.
The divorce is the solution in some ways.
Yeah, the solution, the divorce may actually be the good thing.
Yeah.
And the earlier that happens, probably the better. But these things are extremely common. Like when we we give a questionnaire, and I would say, 50% of the patients that I see with gut issues have had that. And some of them are really well aware, they had horrible, particularly alcoholism in the family creates some of the worst, situations. And the biggest trauma, then obviously when you read all the news now about, war situations, what these kids go through, you can predict that all of them will have disturbances in there. Nobody talks about that, what the long-term disturbances in brain function of these people is. It's not the physical trauma, it's the emotional trauma.
Well, and is it acting in two ways? So if you have this childhood trauma, is it acting directly on your gut and it's acting on your brain, and then your gut is also acting on your brain, if that makes sense?
I think the most likely is it acts on the brain primarily. And then, anything that happens at the brain level, like emotion. So there's these circuits within the brain that generate emotions. And then they're linked to what we call the central autonomic networks that generate signals that go back to the body. So anytime anybody experiences a negative emotion, that will be mirrored in the gut. So
I read this in your book, and I always I kind of had a vague sense of my stomach hurts when I'm stressed or blah, blah. And you're like, no, on a physiological level, your gut is mirroring what's going on in your brain.
Yeah, and it's actually fairly specific what emotion it is. So it's different for the fear response or anger. So fear response that inhibits your stomach and stimulates the end. So the two parts of your GI tract that are most susceptible to these influences is the proximal part, so the esophagus and the stomach, and the end of your intestine that receives the strongest inputs. So that's why you have these symptoms, what's now called functional dyspepsia, or symptoms that are referred to the upper GI tract, often reflect a inhibition of gastric contractions. And on the other hand, with anger, you get the opposite. You get this really strong And all this has been measured in experiments.
Wait, so with anger, you get really strong gastric contraction? So will you feel like you need to poop when you're angry? Or no?
So gastric, so it's the upper part. So you feel like, cramps in your upper part of your stomach. And with anxiety and stress, it's the lower part. There's urge to have a bowel movement or diarrhea.
Yeah. That's so. My first time I did my first event on my book tour, I was doing like a one-woman show, and they were actively introducing me, and I turned to my husband and I was like, I really need to poop. And he was like, you can't go poop. Like, they're actively introducing you for hundreds of people. And I was like, no, I really need to. But I think that was just my anxiety.
Yeah, that was anxiety.
And I did the show, and it was great. Yeah, well, so this is all why you say you shouldn't eat while you're stressed, correct?
I mean, always trying to sort of go back in evolution and in history. So food intake in general, particularly once cooking became part of human interactions, it was a social event, sitting together, being relaxed, feeling good. With animals, a little bit different. When you see, when a lion catches an animal and then they fight over it, and with the other lions. But with humans, it's pretty clear. It's a social event, and that's a very important point to come back to. And a feel-good event, and it puts your stomach in its default digestive mode. The increased vagal tone, parasympathetic balance, and minimum amount of the sympathetic influence, which is the stress part of your autonomic nervous system. So there's studies like, with the Mediterranean diet. I now use the term Mediterranean lifestyle and not diet, because I believe, and there's evidence from studies, that a big part of the benefit of the Mediterranean diet is that social interactions when you eat something. We have experienced this many times traveling in Italy. In summertime, everybody sits outside and spends the whole evening together, not just once going out for dinner. It's like, that's the lifestyle, Everybody's outside and together. Yeah, and there's studies now that suggest that that's more important than what people actually eat during that time. We've been in different cities in Italy, so almost each year we go to a different place, get invited to give a talk. And then the last one was in the center northern part of Italy, Parma, which is famous for its ham, for its unhealthy food items. Ham and pasta and cheese, at least in restaurants, that's all that's on the menu. We had a hard time finding a salad or a side, a vegetable dish. I said, this can't be true. This is not the Mediterranean diet, And then I was curious. I looked up the statistics on life expectancy. It's the same as in Sicily, where they really eat the Mediterranean diet with fish mainly and very little, red meat. The main factor in the life expectancy is that's social part. It's kind of surprising. We like to focus on diet because we can't really do too much about changing people's behavior in big cities. It's hard to live that lifestyle.
It's also just harder to study, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Being like, go have dinner with your family or friends every night, and we'll come back and look into that versus eat this diet and we'll see these results. But you think that we're over-indexing on the food part and we're under-indexing on the social and the slowing down and the lifestyle part?
Yeah, I've come to the conclusion it's a real holistic view of gut health, that it's influenced obviously by the brain. We know a lot of studies about the negative ones, the stress, anxiety, anger. Much fewer studies on the positive dimensions of brain states like relaxation, meditation. There's some studies, so we actually did one with mindfulness-based stress reduction, which did have an effect on symptoms and brain-gut interactions. But in general, I would say that the science really supports that idea that multiple factors contribute. It's kind of the systems biological view. The traditional model was that there's one factor and you have a hypothesis what this one factor does to one outcome. And this works less and less. So now, systems biology, where you look at the behavior of a whole system, multiple factors influencing the outcome. And there's other approaches now with AI that, you feed in a massive amount of data and the AI looks at it holistically. It looks at what all these factors do to the outcome. So I'm a strong believer of this holistic approach. Holistic is an old-fashioned term, but it really fits well here. It's this systems biological that spiritual, emotional factors from the brain, exercise from your muscles, diet, and whatever else you put into your gut, they all interact. And because they interact, different people have different components. And then the genes obviously provide the background. And since if you take 100 people, there are not many who are exactly the same, in terms of these factors. I think this whole movement now, personalized medicine, you have to tailor your treatment recommendations to the individual constellation. And we still have a long way to go before we can do this well. And as I mentioned, AI will be one way of doing this, to be measuring more and more things and have wearable devices to look at our heart rate variability, vagal tone. All this goes into this equation, ultimately will tell us what the best treatment is. Is it exercise? Is it, weight loss? Is it, of all of these, probably diet is the most tangible and probably the easiest to implement. I mean, you can tell people, here's a cookbook, go with these. If they do it at the end and if they sustain it, it's another question. But I think a lot of people are willing to try.
For sure. But also, I do think there's a lot of people out there who would prioritize eating with friends or eating with family or slowing down if they knew that was having a tangible impact. It wasn't just something they were doing because it was a little reward or they get to do it if they finish everything on their to-do list, but actually this was an important part of their brain health and their body health.
It is.
What impact does eating while you're stressed have on how you're digesting the food, how you're assimilating the food, on your gut health, on your brain health, on all of that?
Yeah, so just imagine when you're stressed, these signals from the brain, mainly the autonomic nervous system, the stress branch, the sympathetic, and the parasympathetic, the more relaxed part, they get activated. You have a much more stronger sympathetic tone. It changes pretty much every dimension of your gut function, from contractions, regional transit, how fast things go, empty from the stomach, empty through the small intestine, how long they stay in the colon. So each of those are affected by the stress level. And then you have also the cortisol, which we know less about, even though people always talk about cortisol level, the fight and flight response, but it's not. So we're not in the fight and flight response. In general, it's a very different kind of stress. It's a chronic, sustained stress level that not necessarily goes along with an increased cortisol level, but it does go along, our studies have shown, with an increased level of gene expression of the sympathetic nervous system that changes all these gut functions. It also, it stimulates acid secretion. It changes blood flow. It changes the immune cells in your gut. It changes the microbes. So the microbes have receptors on their surface that respond to like the sympathetic nervous system neurotransmitters, norepinephrine. So if you're stressed, your microbes know that. And there's a change in their gene expression and a change in their behavior. So if you have any potentially harmful bacteria in your gut, they will attack your gut more likely under a stressful situation. So imagine when you're eating and you're stressed, your gut is completely different. And it's not the minor stress that's important. It's the real, as I said, this chronic, what we call allostatic load. So, and a lot of people are in that condition.
A lot of people, yeah. So what advice would you give to somebody listening? Let's say they are struggling with gut issues, or they're trying to prevent brain health issues down the road, or they are dealing with brain health issues. Would you say that having some sort of stress management practice is a really important part of that prevention or of treatment strategy?
Yeah, I would say would probably be number one that I would say.
Wow.
There's so much scientific data that supports that. It affects the microbiome. Just this diet has a negative effect on the microbiome. So stress does the same thing. And if both of them act together, you have the perfect storm. The microbes are under stress from two sides, from the brain, from the stress system, and from an unhealthy diet, an inflammatory diet. And that's what a lot of people now in the US are under in that situation. And I think that's the cause of this chronic disease epidemic that we have, that politicians now want to attack. And hopefully this will happen. And it's a massive undertaking. I mean, you have to start in kindergarten. You have to start with how mothers during pregnancy, because the stress during pregnancy affects both the brain development of the infant, but also affects the mother's microbiomes. And these microbes are changed in a stressed mother. So the infant gets the first colonization of its gut by an unhealthy microbiome.
Yeah, you've said that the first 3 years of our lives are really critical to our brain and our mental health and our microbe development. Are there things that a mother can be doing during pregnancy or during the first 3 years of their lives that they could sort of add in that would increase health outcomes down the line?
Yeah, so the impact of, I would say, diet/obesity, stress, and intake of antibiotics. There's animal studies that one dose of an antibiotic in a pregnant mouse has an impact on the microbiome, the health of the microbiome of the offspring. And I'm sure a lot of women take antibiotic for whatever reason, during pregnancy.
And obviously, some are warranted. Antibiotics are incredibly life-saving, but the idea would be avoid antibiotics that aren't necessary. Like when you go to the doctor and you have something that's viral and they're just like, oh, just take this antibiotic just to be safe.
Yeah, so 90% of infections, particularly in children, are viral, and all these antibiotics that are given to newborns, and it's often the mothers that demand it because they're so worried about their child. And then there are these stories, that people tell afterwards. Oh yeah, my child was so sick, but once they gave him or her the antibiotic, the infection went away. That's probably. So I don't believe these stories because the statistics tell us most are viral, and antibiotic will not help with the viral infections.
So judicious use of antibiotics would be one thing to sort of be aware of.
Yeah, that's one thing. I think being aware that obesity and associated metabolic syndrome is definitely a risk factor. So diet, paying attention to the weight, stress, and antibiotics, I think would be the three things that I would list as one of the main factors.
And then what about when the child is born in those first 3 years of life? What can we be doing to optimize those outcomes?
Minimizing sugar, and that has two reasons. Because if the baby or the infant is exposed to very sweet foods and sugar and desserts, and the taste preferences are programmed early in life as well during the first year. So this child or this adult later will have a very different level of getting comfort based on the sweetness of the food.
Wait, I didn't know that. The taste preferences are set during your first year of life? Is my sweet tooth programmed by my first year of life?
Yeah. So it's a big factor, and it's not set in stone. You can retrain it back
By changing your microbiome?
No, by changing your sugar intake, not just sugar but sweet intake. So This is also artificial or non-nutritive sweeteners. If you wean yourself off this or get off them completely, your taste preference will adapt, and you will no longer crave for the sugar.
Wait, it's interesting, though, that's set. I've never heard that's set in the first year of your life. The other thing that you mentioned, you believe there's a link to our microbes and our inflammation levels and all of that in pregnancy is autism. There's a lot of conversation about autism right now. Do you think there's a vaccine connection to autism?
No, I don't believe this. As a scientist, I have to say, you're always open. So if there's evidence coming out that disproves your belief, then you have to change it. And I've done this many times in my career. But at the moment, I think there's overwhelming evidence that there's no connection. But there are factors. So infections of the mother during pregnancy, there's examples from a flu epidemic in Scandinavia some 20 or 30 years ago where the autism rate went up. But there's also evidence that both in animal studies and in women, that obesity and metabolic syndrome, so basically, obesity, hypertension, and metabolic derangements increases the risk of autism offspring. It's sort of clear. I mean, autism doesn't start it after the baby is born, even though most efforts today start with with clinical trials or fecal microbial transplants in anywhere from 1 to 10 years of age, and I think that's way too late, because when you think about it, brain development happens in utero, and the microbiome of the mother, produces molecules, all these neuroactive molecules and inflammatory molecules that can cross the placenta and can affect brain development of infants. There's studies from some colleagues at UCLA that have actually shown that this happens in animal models. And to me, it's surprising how long it's taken for this concept to take hold. Is that this starts prenatally, factors from the mother or the environment, infections, autism keeps increasing progressively. But I think that's more likely associated with the increasing rate of obesity and metabolic derangements that humans in modern society since.
The infections part is interesting because that would actually be an argument for vaccines for pregnant women if we're trying to avoid getting infectious diseases that could contribute to this type of thing.
Absolutely. It's kind of ironic that we have the opposite discussion now. Certainly before you get pregnant, you should make sure there's no chance that you are going to develop measles or any other infectious disease where we have vaccines for.
How do GLP-1s impact our gut microbiome?
If you believe the data that's been published on this, they actually have a positive effect. They change the gut microbes into a less inflammatory pattern. I'm a little bit doubtful because, I know how industry, the pharmaceutical industry, what tricks they play to increase sales. And, some of these studies may have been financed by the companies, by Lilly and other companies.
But knowing what you know about sort of the mechanisms of actions of these drugs on our guts, what would your hypothesis be? Or
they clearly act through the gut, So this GLP-1 receptor responds to hormones released by so-called enteroendocrine cells in the gut. So one of the biggest parts of our endocrine system, hormonal system, is in the gut, in these specialized cells. What I learned in medical school, that food components, protein and fat, would stimulate these hormonal cells. So after a meal, you feel satiated and full. So what we know now with the microbes, so the microbes also produce molecules that stimulate these same cells to release this satiety hormone. So we have both a direct effect of the diet and the effect of the microbes, the microbial molecules that they generate. So we don't know if that's the only mechanism. So when you take the GLP-1 agonists, you take them in much higher doses that are ever produced physiologically. So we don't know what that does. So typically, a receptor would desensitize if you expose it to a very high dose of the agonist. So that doesn't seem to happen with the GLP-1s. The second one is, there's so many studies coming out, and you have to be careful. Again, what I said earlier, industry is sponsoring all these studies. They want more and more indications, But it does seem to be true that it has a beneficial effect on some other chronic diseases that are related to this chronic disease epidemic. This could all be because you get a healthier metabolism and you lose weight, but it could also be, for example, the effect on craving and on substance use disorders. That could be a totally different mechanism. So initially, when I talked about GLP-1s, I got these nasty comments on social media. Oh, you're just an industry guy and you're promoting these, and we should change our lifestyles. Well, changing lifestyles has not helped with obesity. So many things have been tried, different diets, and the GLP-1s have a relatively small amount of side effects considering intervention with a high dose of a hormone. And now with all these new things coming out, even if only a few of them are true, like the substance use disorder component, it would be a miracle drug, and it would help people. And there's now also attempts. Initially was the recommendation you have to stay on lifelong. Obviously, industry loved that concept. But now there's studies coming out that you can, once you lose your weight, your 10 or 20 pounds, you can go on an intermittent schedule, that you'd only take them once a month or every 3 months. So that would be an amazing thing if you think that you could actually bring a large percentage of the population, 40% of the American population, to a normal weight, and then relatively inexpensively could keep them at this weight.
So you're cautiously optimistic.
I'm cautiously optimistic, and I was interested in trying it out.
You did it yourself?
Yeah, I did it myself, and because I just wanted to see it. And so you will be satiated with half of your plate, and you won't touch alcohol anymore, which was an amazing thing to me. You won't eat the dessert, so but then to maintain this habit, I think you still have to have the healthy diet recommendations. So I think the combination that I see now is, I'm very enthusiastic and very optimistic about, unless some unexpected long-term side effects come out. I mean, that we never know until 10 years later. I think that's the first time in modern, like post-World War II history, that we can actually effectively treat obesity with all it's not just a cosmetic thing, it's all these other chronic diseases associated with it.
We're going to get into a lot of pragmatic action steps, like when you've said healthy diet, what have you meant by that? Things like that in a second. But first, I just want to address, how do we know if we have a healthy gut? Are you a fan of any of the microbe tests that are out there? Are we just doing this in a symptom way? As a normal person who's not just going into a GI doctor to assess this, how can we know if our anxiety, if our brain health stuff, if that is related to our gut health?
Yeah, I think it's an unfortunate trend, and obviously it's driven by the marketing on social media, of these stool tests, aggressive marketing. I've talked to people who are also involved in this at the cutting edge of that kind of clinical research. It's almost like there should be specialists that are just focused on, that give you the advice when you have this test and you have these findings, and they can give you a special advice. They can tell you this has to do with anxiety, or you need to change your diet in a certain way. These specialists don't exist right now. There's also differences in the quality of these tests. The initial ones, I used the techniques at the time that were sort of considered state of the art, but they're no longer the case. There's newer ones that I sort of support. Tiny Health is one that I like in some ways the most, and I'm actually collaborating with them. There's Jonah, and it's difficult for the lay public, and the physicians right now, the way they're trained, to give you advice. So you rely on the dietitians of these companies that get on the phone with you after you had a test and tell you. Some of these dietitians are actually pretty sophisticated, in my experience, what I've seen, but probably not all of them. They give you advice that is not evidence-based.
So it's almost like the tests can be good, but the interpretation of the tests is not where we would want it to be.
Yeah, and it could be, in I would say in 5 years from now, that you'll get a much better recommendation from it. There's also some tests that take just blood samples. They look at the molecules that the microbes produce to get into your systemic circulation. Kind of the easiest one, because you don't have to collect a stool sample, which for a lot of people is kind of not
gross.
Gross. Yeah, it's funny that all of a sudden this can be dinner conversations. What stool tests do you use? Yeah, I think this field will progress further. I mean, there's also all these potentials, which we're not quite certain yet. Is your gut microbiome, or the ecological health of your gut microbiome, is it good for you right now? Does it put you at risk for Parkinson's? Does it put you at risk for Alzheimer's? If that can be confirmed, and what tests do you need for that? I mean, that would have huge implications. And I think this could become a standard test that you, not as a young person, but certainly before your middle age, because some of these diseases, these neurodegenerative diseases, start in middle age, in your 40s. Even now, you could probably, when you take one of these tests, you could tell, in combination with the risk genes that always play a role, that you're at a high risk of developing cognitive decline. I'm not sure if I would want to know that, quite honestly, because it could really ruin the rest of your life. But you could look at your lifestyle and counteract it, at the early stage. Same with Parkinson's, probably.
So in absence of kind of the level of information we'd want to have, like if I'm trying to figure out if my anxiety is rooted in my gut in some way, am I just going based off symptoms, or should we all just generally be doing all these things that are good for our gut and like hoping that will pay off down the line? Like, how do we know if our gut is contributing in absence of these better diagnostic tools?
My recommendation at the moment, unless you have diagnosed anxiety disorder, I think, but in general, I would say you should follow the general guidelines of a healthy diet and healthy lifestyle. Unless you can't afford it, I mean, this is a big barrier, So when we talk about the conversation applies mainly to the bi-coastal areas, wealthy, highly educated individuals. I think if you go in the middle of the country or to the south, also along socioeconomic boundaries, a lot of this, what we're talking about, is not reality. They don't have access to these healthy foods. They can't afford it.
For people who don't have access to the ideal diet, what are some things that most people would have access to that would actually move the needle?
I would say probably most people have access to a variety of fruits and vegetables, or fresh fruits and vegetables. So the general recommendation it's based on one study. So I wouldn't say that that's a gold standard, but that's what everybody goes by. Some 35 different fruits and vegetables a week. There's one approach that I think is very exciting and is a nonprofit that was started by a woman, Nora Latore. This nonprofit is called Eat Real, and they go they've gone into the school system. And I don't know exactly yet, even though I'm on the advisory board, how they've done it. They've been extremely successful. They're targeting now 1 million children that they reach in all socioeconomic categories. So they are in the South. So I just did a recent podcast with Nora, and who's super excited. I mean, that somebody could accomplish something like this is almost unbelievable, because we would think that the parents, the mothers, are opposed to this, that they tell them in school what they should eat instead of what the mothers thought they should be eating. But she said it was completely the opposite. There was enthusiasm by the mothers that that their children are sort of on a trajectory to healthy eating. When Michelle Obama tried this, it failed because it was considered a government intervention in person's lives. So if it comes from a nonprofit, I think that's a more successful model. I don't know if this Mayer movement will do something like this. I doubt it. But so it can be done.
So you think we need systemic intervention in some way?
Yeah, this is not
an onus of the individual situation.
And I could imagine once you introduce these kids to this healthy eating style, and they're doing outcome studies, they feel better, they have less emotional issues. It sounds almost too good to be true, but they have such huge numbers now. Then they would also be interested to read more about it. So right now they have no clue about this connection. Kids in underprivileged neighborhoods, but if that model works, that it really changes children's behavior and insights and awareness, that could be the biggest solution. I think if it comes from the government, it's generally, it's certainly based on experience what we have seen so far, it didn't work.
What's the nonprofit called again?
Eat Real.
Eat Real. Okay.
Everybody should look this up.
Yeah.
Great. It's not a company, with a lot of volunteers, and mothers are volunteers in that as well.
Okay, so let's say we're now speaking to people who do have access and they just want the best information out there to transform their health. You've said healthy diet a few times. In your mind, what is the ideal diet for our gut?
So starting with the one thing that we know has the worst effects is decreasing the amount of sugar. And that's not just the sugar that you add in your cup of coffee or eating cakes. Sugar is ubiquitous now. The high fructose corn syrup is used because it's so cheap. It's government subsidized. So companies use it as a kind of a filler for anything from ketchup to sauce. Like all these salad dressings, they all have have that in it.
And why is sugar bad for our gut?
It has all these downstream metabolic effects that are all negative. So I would say it's not only gut targeted. It's much wider, the metabolism. But in the gut, it does have an effect on the gut microbiome, as do the non-nutritive sweeteners, the sugar substitutes.
And do you mean both the less healthy ones we think of like aspartame and sucralose, and the ones that we think of as like having a bit more of a health halo, like stevia and erythritol?
Yeah, I think we did a recent review on this, and I think stevia came out as the best one. Some of the other ones are basically, synthetic chemicals that some are non-absorbed, and they definitely, I think these studies were done not with stevia, but with sucralose and, some.
So like Diet Coke.
Yeah. Yeah, Diet Coke is a horrendous thing. I mean,
for gut health.
For gut health. And it would be so easy. And also, if I look in the crystal ball, the way that the soft drink industry will be moving, there's some really exciting developments that are also good for gut health. So one is there's companies that make fiber molecules, synthetic fiber molecules, that can be added to these drinks. And there's a big interest now of the big Cokes and, Coca-Cola, and to add these. And then you have basically a soft drink that gives you half of the amount of fiber that you need, for your health. How this then interacts, it's hard to say with stevia, and you provide the fiber, which has the beneficial effects on the gut, if that outweighs it. But I think the soft drink industry will go through some dramatic positive changes. Right now, it's terrible because people have this illusion. Even most of my colleagues at UCLA, I always watch this when we have a noon lecture, and Diet Coke is still by far the most popular drink.
Like people perceive that to be healthier than normal Coke. And you're saying they both have a pretty bad effect on your microbiome.
Yeah. And I forgot now what's in Diet Coke, what the main sweetener is.
I think it's aspartame.
Aspartame, yeah.
I'm pretty sure. Okay, so thing one, get rid of sugar. And that includes artificial sugars.
And the way you do this, so you look at the labels. So I think people have to learn to look at the labels. One of the first things that we look, and my wife looks at, is the sugar thing on these white tables that they are on the bottle, on the product, the amount of added sugar.
And then I got to ask, fruit sugar.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. So fruit juices, we take out the fiber from the juice and just have the sugar then, are almost certainly not healthy. Obviously you take up vitamins, orange juice. I'm always surprised, if you go in any restaurant, there's always the glass, do you want orange juice? And it's kind of the worst thing for your metabolic health to get this boost of sugar, and your insulin goes up, insulin spike. And if you eat the whole fruit, there's tons of fiber in it and health-promoting molecules that both slow down the gastric emptying of the sugar, so prevent that spike, but also counteract the absorption.
So you're pro whole fruit, but anti-fruit with the fiber extracted.
Yeah, and there was for a while, I think 5 years ago, this juicing movement.
Yeah. I did. I started, I think very early in my health journey, I had a juicer and I was juicing every day, and I was making pretty green, gross juices. It's like garlic and kale and stuff. They're not good, but I started in that whole world.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, that has fortunately gone away.
Yeah.
But definitely, whole fruit is definitely something I think.
You're pro. You're not. Because there's definitely a lot of people online who are like, don't even eat whole fruit. Yeah. That's not you.
Absolutely not.
Okay, cool. So we're getting rid of sugar. What else are we doing? What are the next steps for our healthy diet? We're constructing the healthiest possible diet for our gut.
You stay away from ultra-processed food. And that kind of overlaps with the sugar, because most ultra-processed foods have high amounts of sugar and chemical additives. A good example is on the airlines, you get these pretzels, what they call pretzels, mini pretzels. If you look at the rear side of that package, it probably has 50 names on it, chemical names. They have no idea what this is. It's all chemicals. So that's a typical ultra-processed food. So you want to eliminate that. And that includes a lot of things. So it's not just processed. So processed foods, almost everything we eat is processed.
Like olive oil is a processed food.
Yogurts
Hummus is a processed food.
I mean, almost everything.
Yeah.
Unless you eat raw vegetables. I mean, that's
yeah.
So, but the ultra processed, it's the addition of all these molecules and the extraction of fiber. So you take out the good things and you add the sugar and you add the chemicals to it and fats to it. So a lot of the snacks, and power bars, I think you have to be very careful if that doesn't fall into the category of ultra-processed foods. So that would be the second. Then the things that you don't want to avoid but you want to increase actually is if it's available, this high variety of fresh fruits and vegetables. And then there's the question, we talked about it earlier briefly, about how is this food grown? Is it organic? Is it regenerative, organically grown?
A lot of people say that doesn't matter because organic food is sprayed with just different chemicals than non-organic food. You think there's enough data right now that shows that non-organic food is having some sort of negative impact on our gut microbiome?
It's not just the spraying of things on foods. The organic label, I think, is fairly fluid. It's not 100% strict. But it's both the things that are being sprayed on it in increasing amounts because a lot of the herbs and the bugs have become resistant, so they keep increasing the amount of the chemicals that they use, Roundup. This is where the regenerative organic comes in. This is a movement that's still starting. The reason that's important because chemical agriculture is basically putting chemical fertilizer in the ground, getting beautiful big fruits and vegetables. But what it does, it basically suppresses the microbiome of the soil, and so normally there's this close interactions between the microbes in the soil and the roots of the plants, and the microbes stimulate the plants to produce these health-promoting molecules. So if you eat, and there are studies on this, if you eat food that's grown in regenerative organic fashion, so without the chemical fertilizers, it has much higher concentrations of polyphenol molecules,
which are also good for your gut, right?
Yeah, they're antioxidants. And we can come back to this in a minute. It's kind of demanding, for a person that goes shopping. So what exactly is important, So the gold standard, I would say, the farmer's market that you verified yourself. Second one, if you go to a market that has an organic section, it still may be not the ideal food. Ideally, buy it from farmers that use this regenerative organic technique. The polyphenol molecules, so we always talk about fiber, So the reason that these 35 different vegetables and fruits per week are important is because there's many different kinds of fiber and there's many different kinds of these polyphenol molecules, thousands really. So if you just eat tomatoes only, you're vegan and you live with tomatoes or one other vegetable, it's not beneficial to your microbes. That if you eat this number of fruits and vegetables, it forces the ecosystem in your gut to diversify because you need to bring in microbes that are specialized for the specific fiber or for the specific polyphenols that are in different kinds of plants. So the more you add this in, and it could take a while. So if you have been on the standard American diet for most of your life, and I wouldn't recommend from one day to the other go onto the 35 vegetables, because you're probably going to get bloated and for all kinds of symptoms. So you gradually have to do this and imagine that you bring in more and more, I would call it immigrants into the gut ecosystem that have special skills, and so it's very similar to other ecosystems, that diversity changes with the challenge that an ecosystem has in terms of what they have to process, and I would say that applies both to the fibers and to the polyphenols. The fibers have gotten more attention. The polyphenols are kind of similar molecular structures as these human milk oligosaccharides, these very large ones, that our gut cannot absorb intact. So if you eat these fruits and vegetables with those components, they will move down into the end of your small intestine and the large intestine because the microbes have the tools to break them down into smaller. So the polyphenols become phenols. And then these molecules, they feed the microbes, they increase the diversity, so improve gut health. But they're also absorbed, they're anti-inflammatory, and they're also absorbed just like the fiber metabolites and go into your systemic circulation, go all the way into your brain, and do a lot of things for your overall health. So it's kind of interesting how plants are the main suppliers of these things that are the best for our gut health and for our overall health, you know. And the plants produce these molecules. So if a plant is stressed, for example, in a drought or with infestations or with any challenges, it sends signals down into its root system, and the root system secretes these sugar molecules, and the sugar molecules attract these microbes in the soil. And then the microbes stimulate the plant to produce these remedies, basically these polyphenols. So a stressed plant produces more of these than a plant that's not stressed. That plant may not show the same beautiful fruits and vegetables as you get in the Whole Foods market.
But that's another reason why having organic will have higher rates of these polyphenols, because when you're protecting them with the pesticide, that chain is not kicking off, essentially.
Yeah, you interfere essentially with this natural process.
Yeah.
And I've sort of been fascinated how it's come up with this One Health concept, how the health of the soil, the health of the plant, and the health of the gut, and the health of our organism, they all are connected. You know, it's an amazing story.
Are there any other food things that, like, we definitely need to be talking about this? We need to paying attention to this when it comes to our gut microbes.
Always a story about red meat. It's not just the meat, it's also the antibiotics that you eat with that meat. And again, if it's organically raised meat, grass-fed meat, that all lessens the negative effects. I think the fanciest and the most tasty steaks, so we have eliminated red meat from our diet, are the ones that are marbled, which is all fat. So, you know, that fat is not good for your gut health, and it's one of the inflammatory molecules. Replacing, not totally, but to a large degree, red meat with poultry and fish is definitely a way to go. In our current world, all these better products also have their problems, you know, with contamination in the ocean. So the fish that you eat have mercury content, and the same thing with the chicken. The way the chickens are raised, you know, is also horrendous, and the antibiotics they get. And you go back to the same thing. If you can get organic chicken, pasture-fed chicken, it's more expensive, but it's definitely there's evidence that is beneficial, you know.
What do you think about dairy?
It's another controversial topic. The reason that our organisms have enzymes to break down dairy or milk or lactose is basically to optimize us for the postnatal period. So, you know, where milk is a good thing and the body has, or the gut has, enzymes, lactase, that breaks down the milk. Most adults, with the exceptions of the Inuits and some Scandinavians, lose most of their enzyme that breaks down lactose. And so a lactose or lactase deficiency is the normal state. It's not some patients come to me and say, I've been diagnosed with lactose deficiency. Well, that's the normal state for an adult in the Western world. I would say milk products, unless you're Scandinavian or an Inuit, is not something that I recommend, unless they're fermented. You know, we basically break down a lot of the milk sugar.
So like a kefir.
Yeah, or yogurt or Greek. You know, Greek yogurt is obviously a great product because of the high protein content.
Okay, so yes to fermented dairy, but you pretty much don't. Does cheese count as fermented dairy?
Yeah, cheese. Yeah, cheese is
thank
fermented.
God.
And it's, you know, it's probably part of the explanation for what's called the French paradox, that the French and the Belgians consume more cheese than anybody else, and that doesn't come along with a higher mortality or more, you know. And it's partially, one thing could be that they eat a lot of fermented foods, and cheese in the rind of the cheese, that's where most of the microbes are. Each cheese has a different population of microbes. That's why they taste different and why they smell different. So to eat a variety of cheese is probably a good thing.
Okay.
Not the kind of cheese you put on a hamburger, that is basically totally ultra processed.
But like a good Parmesan or something like that we
absolutely
love. Okay, you heard it here first. Are there lifestyle factors that you think have an outsized effect on our gut microbes and our brain health, either in a positive way or a negative way?
Yeah, so exercise, physical exercise, there have been studies on that. So mild to moderate, but regular aerobic exercise has a positive effect on the health of the microbiome. High performance exercise has a negative effect. That's perceived by the body and the brain and the gut as a stressor. And you see exactly the same changes you would see with a severe psychological, with trauma. You get increased permeability or leakiness, inflammation, diarrhea. If you do these things like marathon running, which has obviously become very popular, it's good for your mental well-being, I think, but it's not beneficial for your physical health or your gut health. I would say clearly a benefit through stress reduction and probably through other mechanisms as well that, we incompletely understand. I mean, there are studies also on long-term meditators that have shown an effect on the gut microbiome.
Do you meditate?
I try to, I do sort of simple things like autogenic training or progressive muscle relaxation, which is sort of a cheap way of doing meditation. Been phases in my life where I've done it more regularly in the Zen Center at downtown LA. But with our lifestyles, it's hard to do it.
But the research bears out that it is beneficial.
Yeah, but then there's a strange thing. If you look at the life expectancy, I always like to go back to real life examples, just like in Italy and in Parma. The life expectancy of monks is not higher. If anything, a lot of them die at an earlier age. This may have to do to other factors. I mean, living in high altitude in the Himalayas may not be the healthiest thing. But the meditation by itself does not guarantee that you become a centenarian.
That's interesting. I think of it, though, as like because our daily lives are so stressful, we need to figure out some way to mitigate that, whether it's meditation or reading or the community time, like all of these things we've talked about. But like to not have something to deal with the fact that modern life is really stressful is problematic.
Yeah. And so once you recognize it and you realize the health implications of this allostatic load, I think that gives you motivation to and both the regular and average exercise and the meditative, the contemplative practices. And I would include everything, even the short periods of abdominal breathing, I would count into this.
Or like dinner with your friends.
Dinner with your friends.
Yeah, back to what we talked about at the beginning. Like that is an important health practice and we need to be talking about it as such.
Yeah, and I have a student, actually she's a postdoc now who's doing these studies on positive emotions on the microbiome. So there's a whole literature on this, how not on the microbiome, but the effect of positive emotions on health and well-being, which is kind of interesting. And there's something called sympathia. And there are studies that this sympathia, which is sort of this positive emotion towards your children, and towards your people around you, has this health promoting effect. It's amazing that it's the first time that I heard this through her.
That's cool.
But so she's now studying this on the microbiome.
So stay tuned.
Yeah.
Cool. Can you leave us with just one homework assignment, something that we can all do as soon as we turn off this podcast that will have a positive impact on our gut and thus our brains?
Assuming that you have not done anything, these various things that we have talked about in this, maybe spend 10 minutes and do your diaphragmatic breathing, stimulating your vagal nerve, changing your whole mode of operation of the brain into a parasympathetic mode, which is beneficial for your gut and for your health in general.
And those are just deep breaths into your belly?
Into your belly. It's an interesting thing with my patients. I do this with every patient. The first thing is I look at them when they're lying down. First thing is to take a deep breath. And most people will do it into the chest. They think a deep breath always has to be into the chest. And then you show them, put your hand on your belly and make your belly come in and out. Most patients can do this fairly quickly, but there's some patients who cannot do it, who are unable. And I think they really have a major issue in terms of switching their system. It's also interesting that children up to 18 years of age do this, the belly breathing naturally. But there's something as an adult, I guess, with the stress level that we shifted to this, fight and flight response pattern.
Interesting. All right. So breathe into your belly. Well, thank you so much, Emeran. Do you want to take a second and shout out your books, your online programs, all of that, anything you want to direct people to?
The simplest way is to go to my website, emeranmayer.com, and there's a lot of opportunities that you have going to our newsletter or subscribe to our newsletter. Like you see the books I've published, The Mind-Gut Connection, Mind-Gut Immune Connection, the recipe book, The Interconnected Plates, and there's also a podcast that you can... So going to the website, I think, will open a whole...
the whole world.
The whole world. And we're in the process of expanding this also with products. I've been skeptical for a long time of supplements, but there's a small, a limited group of supplements that I think has scientifically based benefits. And there will also be things like extra virgin olive oil from a special site in southern Italy. So that part we're developing. It's actually my son who is developing that part. But ultimately, you'll be able to go to this website and find everything you need, both educationally, awareness-wise, practices, and products.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.
Unfortunately, that is all for this episode. Make sure that you're following the Liz Moody podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube so that you never miss out on an episode. Following means that new episodes will show up right in your feed. And also, we now have full video versions of all of our episodes. If you're watching Hi Hello on Spotify and YouTube too. I've started to love watching podcasts. It's really fun. So if you're in that camp, let me know. But we have full video episodes for you if you are interested. We're able to bring you this show completely for free thanks to the amazing brands that we partner with. If you're looking for science-backed products to elevate every single part of your life, you can find all of our current discount codes at lizmoody.com/codes. We have codes for like workout plans, for different types of supplements, for delivery food stuff. We've like anything you're thinking about, we've probably got a code for the best product in that category. And do not forget to sign up for our newsletter. It's called The Takeaway. You can find that at lizmoody.substack.com. It's where we break down every single episode with action steps, with challenges and bonus content. You can also find full transcripts for every single episode over there. And really interesting things that we don't cover anywhere else. Like we just published a deep dive into if red dye is actually harmful to our health. I know there's been a lot of public conversation around that. So we were like, what does the science actually say? So you can find that over at lizmoody.substack.com. Lastly, come hang out with me on Instagram. I am at Liz Moody. I have completely revamped my Instagram recently to make it even more helpful to you. So go check it out and give me your honest feedback. Or you can be like, I hate it. And let me know that too. I want to know whatever you got to say. Okay, I love you. I love that we get to spend this time together. I love that we get to learn and grow together and that we get to aspire to do the most with our precious time on this planet. And I will see you next time on the Liz Moody Podcast. Oh, just one more thing. It's the legal language. This podcast is presented solely for educational and entertainment purposes. It is not intended as a substitute for the advice of a physician, a psychotherapist, or any other qualified professional.